That's basically what it is. So if you think about it, if I said to you, can I produce a car in my backyard as cheaply as General Motors can produce a car in Oshawa? And your answer would be, of course I can. It would cost me, to produce one car by myself, it probably cost me $5 million. Even if I didn't, I'd have to get all the equipment together. You know it would cost me $5 million. I mean, how would I do it? It would be unbelievably difficult. The reason that GM has a huge plant is because they can, set it up in a way that the workers are more efficient, and they can lower. They've got huge fixed costs, but they're going to lower the fixed cost per unit, and they're going to, in particular, lower the variable cost per unit by having, one person just welding like that, and so on. They're getting all those benefits. So, economies of scale is the idea that firms get bigger so they can produce individual units cheaper. All right, that's the basic idea. Now, in terms of this is expressed kind of incorrectly, if you will. If you think about this, do you think, like, supposing General Motors had a plant that cost them $1 billion and they had 100 workers, and now they produce a plant that costs them $5 billion. Do you think they're going to have 500 workers? What do you guys think? Probably not. Because normally what happens is as you increase the capital, one of the advantages is you decrease the amount of workers, right? So, for example, you used to have, I'm pretty sure, you could almost go to any industry, but I'll just jump. The railway industry in Canada, I think 20 years ago, employed 100,000 people. Today, with more rail traffic and everything else, a lot more being done, they employ 20,000 people because of economies of scale. They've increased, their equipment and stuff, so they've eliminated labor and they've cheapened the overall cost. My reason for that is this, when you increase your capital, you don't normally increase your labor by the same amount. The whole purpose of increasing the capital is to save money on labor, right? Everybody? To reduce the amount of labor. You, for example, in your backyard are digging. Let's suppose you're digging with a shovel and you're digging a hole in the ground for a swimming pool, and you're just using a shovel, and you're taking the shovel and carrying the shovel to the bin in the front of your house and throwing it in shovel by shovel. You're going to spend $100 on a wheelbarrow, which means you're increasing your capital, but you're going to save the labor time because you're going to dump all the wood. Instead of having you carrying the shovel like 50, 100 times from the front yard to the backyard, you're going to load up the wheelbarrow and carry only one. So that's the principle. All right, but the way that this is expressed is like this. We say there are economies of scale if you were to double your capital and labor and you more than doubled your output. That's economies of scale. We say you have constant economies of scale if you were to double your capital and labor and you simply doubled your output. And we say you have decreasing economies of scale or decreasing economies if you doubled your capital and labor and you had not as much, you didn't increase output by the same amount. Now you can imagine on a piece of land, if I was growing wheat and I doubled my capital and labor, I may not get twice as much with wheat. So that would be an example of decreasing economies of scale. An example of constant economies of scale, which prevailed probably throughout the world before 1870, in most industries would be me digging in my backyard. If I have people digging with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and I have one person doing this and I have 10 people doing it, I'm only probably going to increase my output by 10 times. Because there's no real, I'm not really changing the capital, I'm just adding people with their own little bit of capital. So economies of scale is where you increase the capital and supposedly the amount of labor, but as I say, that would be unlikely, such that you increase output more than you increase the capital labor. Now the reason, when you look at that, and again you can go through my notes, we're cutting to the chase, the main idea. I showed formally to you. If you were to triple your output and you were to double your costs, your average cost falls. Everybody? You double your costs and you double your output, your average cost would change. You double your output, or you double your costs and you triple your output, your average cost goes up. So really the key idea, the formal idea is it's an increase in capital and labor that more than increases output. But what it really means is it's an increase in capital and labor that decreases average costs. All right? All right. Now then, having that understanding, we can have different sizes of capital. And what we want to figure out now is the long run average cost function. We've got short run average cost functions. We've done that. That's what we've been doing. Now we want to figure out the long run average cost function. Now the best way to do this is actually with what are called isoquants and isocost lines, which are analogous to budget lines and indifference curves, but we're not going to do that. We don't really need it, but it's actually pretty cool, and you'll do that in second year. But what we're going to do is a derivation by actually a Canadian economist, probably Canada's greatest economist, but you would never know his name, Jacob Viner, who went to McGill, taught at McGill, ended up, I think, at Yale at one point, and then the University of Chicago. But this guy was really interested in many ways, and besides, this one thing about him is amazing. He's a good writer. His book, which you guys, I'm sure you'll never read this, it's called The Monetary History, Monetary Thought in the 19th Century, or something like that. Yeah, something like that. Something like that is a phenomenal book in the sense that it's actually well written. You can actually pick it up, and the guy writes engagingly. It's not boring. It's not that it's fancy. He's just a phenomenally good writer. Okay. But other than that, he's also a really interesting guy. So, Jacob Viner, we don't really care. He derived, this is in like 1925 or something like that, the long run average cost curve from the short run average cost curves in the way that I'm going to do it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to understand how to derive a long run average cost curve, from different short run average cost curves for different size capitals. And then I'm going to use that idea ultimately to get to the point to say, actually in competition, firms will all be the same size, and then we'll just work with the firms being the same size. Everybody? Okay? So this is a necessary evil, but also an important one. And there will be questions on economies of scale. So here I explain the definition in terms of labor and capital increasing and output increasing more. Here I explain it as it relates to average cost in a formal way. Here I give an example and a diagram. I'm going to draw this in a minute. This is what we call the envelope curve, which is the long run average cost curve. You see at the bottom there, the dark line. Then I'm going to show it ideally like this and explain what it means. And then I'm going to use it to show you that all firms will be the same size. And then we're done with the long run equilibrium, which is where I want to be. Okay, so here we go. Follow this. So what Viner said was this. This is the output of a firm, and this is the cost per unit of the firm. And let's do, this is like digging holes. So here is cubic meters. Everybody, cubic meters. If I want a hole that's 10 cubic meters, 100 cubic meters, here's a hole big enough for my garden. Here's a hole big enough, or this is like a hole for a few flowers, a garden bed. Here's a whole new bed for the whole backyard. This is, say, a swimming pool. This is, say, or some little small swimming pool. This is a big swimming pool. This is a foundation for a small house, for a big house. This is a foundation for a 50-story building. Everybody digging bigger holes. Okay? So the first thing I do is I look at my first capital, which is right here. I'm going to call this K0. This is the average cost. The average cost for K0, like this. show you. Because this is the average cost for K0. Everybody? Now it turns out we're going to examine the average cost functions for 3 different size capitals. So far we've only assumed one size. This size of capital is this. I'm going to dig a hole in my backyard using wheelbarrows and shovels. Nothing very sophisticated. So it turns out even with that, and then I'm going to notice because my capital's fixed, I'm going to have 3 wheelbarrows and 3 shovels. I'm going to start digging in my backyard by adding more labor. And as you see, initially, we'll have the usual bit. As we add workers, they become more efficient and average cost falls because one person will specialize in a wheelbarrow, another person will dig, and so on. But at some point, as we have, say, more than 5 workers, we don't have enough wheelbarrows and shovels, so actually our marginal cost goes up and our average cost goes up. Everybody? All right? There it is. And so that means our minimum average cost to produce a hole, and it is, let's say, if we did it that way, it'd be a hole the size of a significant garden bed or something like that. We could get minimum cost there, like $100 or whatever it is, right? For whatever it is. Okay, then here's my second one. Now I'm going to have a small little cat, a bobcat or something like that. I'm going to buy a little machine. It's not a really expensive machine, or I'm going to rent the thing. It's not really expensive. But I'm going to rent this thing, and it's going to be more expensive. The fixed cost is going up, the capital cost is higher. So I get it there, and you'll notice when I bring it to my yard, it means that my average cost of producing, hardly anything, just doing a few scrapes and changing a few flowers around, is more expensive than if I use wheelbarrow and shovel, right? Are you going to get a little cat in to move around a few flowers? No, that would be better to use a shovel and a wheelbarrow. But the bigger the hole I produce, the cheaper I can produce. So I'm going to have something that looks like this. I'll move it over a little bit. It doesn't intersect here in any way, shape, or form. All that it does is, the bigger the hole I get, now if I have a little swimming pool, it's cheaper. If I was, you can see, if I wanted to produce a little swimming pool with wheelbarrows and shovels, it's going to cost me this much. With a little cat, it's going to cost me this much. Everybody? Doesn't that make sense? All right. By the same token, here's another example. We're going to keep this first one running. The first little average cost could be a convenience store. You can get, soap and toothpaste and stuff from the local convenience store, but it's a pretty small place. It can provide you reasonably, it can provide you soap, but the cheapest it can provide you soap is like, say, $5. Then you'll have a kind of store that's bigger than that, maybe 3 times the size of a convenience store. There's a few around town, not many now. It can provide you soap cheaper, but if it was just providing only a few little things, they'd be really expensive because most of the store would be wasted, right? Okay, now I'm going to get a backhoe for my hole. A backhoe is a much bigger machine. So if I was just fooling around with a few flowers again, it would be really expensive, way more expensive. But now I can produce with the backhoe. Here's my deal, right? So it turns out, you can see with the backhoe, if I'm just digging a little swimming pool with the backhoe, I shouldn't use the backhoe, I should use the little cat. But if I'm producing a big swimming pool, I should use the backhoe, not the cat. Everybody, my average cost is less. And this would be the example of a lawnmowers. If I've got a little tiny market, I want a little convenience store. If I have a bigger market, I want a lawnmowers and I can produce cheaper. And then I'm going to get some kind of huge machine to dig, because I'm going to dig a foundation for a downtown building, and this machine can dig that even cheaper. If you dig a foundation, it's the cheapest. But guess what? If I brought this building to my house to dig a little swimming pool, it'd be ridiculous. It would take a whole day to set the thing up. It would reach over my house, take out one scoop and go. but it would take a whole other day and it would cost me a fortune, right? So, economies of scale. If the job is big enough, I can increase my capital, given that there's this technology, and decrease my average cost. Everybody? So now then, it turns out, by the way, supposing I could produce an even bigger hole in the ground, I could get an even bigger machine. But this machine is really good, but actually notice it's not actually, you cannot produce as cheaply as this. If you have to produce a hole this size, this is the one to get, and this is the cheapest you can produce anything. But if you have to produce a hole this big, this sucker won't do it. You have this one would only do part of it, and then you need another one here. So this one would be better for you because it can produce this hole cheaper, but this is not the cheapest, right? Okay, so what Viner said is this: these are your different capitals. Which one would you choose for different sizes? And so, he did this. Like this. He said, okay, look, supposing I want to just work in my garden. Well, that's fine. I go like this. I'm just pipping away. And this is all I get. I get myself some wheelbarrows and shovels, right? That's it. But as soon as I get to this amount of output, here I just have the wheelbarrows and shovels, and up to a certain point, I just change the labor. But once I get to this point, if I'm going to produce anything bigger, I change the capital. So I shift then to this capital here. As I produce this greater output, I change my capital, and then I change my labor as I move along, right? Sorry. And then when I get to this size, I switch again. If I'm going to make swimming pools, big swimming pools, I do this. And then when I'm going to make, something bigger hole, like a downtown thing, foundation, I do this. I switch my capital. Notice everybody? I don't just change my labor, I switch capital as needs be. So if you want to see the long run average cost function, it is the envelope curve, that which envelops from below. And so this red thing here is the envelope curve. All right? This red thing is the long run average cost function. So that everybody understands, I got it from the short run runs, and it showed me how as I shift capital, I get at the minimum average cost. All right? Good. Now then, ideally, supposing I have every gradation in capital. So for example, I could have a bigger shovel and a bigger wheelbarrow. So then I could have different sized cats, and I could have different sized backhoes and stuff like that. Then I could do stuff like this. I would have not only that one, but with a little bit bigger bigger wheelbarrow and shovels, I could have this one. And I could have next this one, right everybody? So what's happening if you do see this, is if I could do this infinitely, I could sketch out, which I won't put, I would have a tangency, I have a thing that's drawn like this. If I could do infinite gradations, I would end up having a long run average cost function that looks like this. Everybody? If I could fill this in with different sizes and this in with different sizes. In other words, if I could change the size of my capital for every change in labor, I could do that. All right, so Viner's envelope curve, long run average cost curve, is simply the idea that you use different capitals and different labors to get this long run average cost function. Now it turns out, here's an oddity, but you don't need to worry about it. You should think about it, but I don't think it would ever be on an exam. You'll notice a real oddity. If I said to you, how do you get the long run average cost function? You'd say you took the minimum point from the individual short run average cost functions. That turns out to be impossible except at one point. Because the minimum point of every short run average cost function would have a slope of 0. And unless the slope of the long run average cost function is 0, they wouldn't be tangent. So it's a bit of an oddity we don't worry about. So then we get this. Having derived it like that, we get this is the long run average cost function. Looks something like that. Now let's look at it specifically and figure out what it is. All right. Now notice here. I want you to tell me where there's economies of scale. Here, are there economies of scale? As I move in this direction, are there economies of scale or not?
Yes.
Yes, because notice average cost is falling. It's because as I increase my capital and labor, I more than increase my output, so my average cost is falling. Here, there's declining economies of scale. Now, that oftentimes doesn't happen. We rarely see that. But in fact, it does happen. And there's many instances of this. When you go to these plants, like a General Motors plant, the plant is huge, but it's not a mile long. They don't have just one single plant in Canada producing cars. The plant, as the assembly line gets longer and longer, they start to get diseconomies of scale, right? Otherwise, we'd end up in a world, and we may end up in a world with only one plant producing everything. But until it's not time, there isn't. But it turns out, if you look at Toronto, essentially in Toronto at this moment of time, or say 10 years ago, there is only one size of kind of basic grocery store, other than the small little specialty grocery stores, like there's a place called Lady York that specializes in Italian food, or this place that specializes in Indian food, or this place that specializes in wealthy food, and so on, pescatarians. But generally, the general supermarkets in town are the same size, Loblaws and Sobeys and Dominion and all the rest, right? Now here's a question for you, why aren't they bigger? You don't see a bigger one. Loblaws has tried for 10 years to get a bigger size because they're afraid of Walmart. Walmart has come to town with a bigger size grocery store. But it's not clear that if you have twice the size of the typical Loblaws, you can actually produce cheaper. Loblaws has actually lost money. They started, I think they got the first profit in the last 3 years. In the last quarter, they've lost a lot of money in trying to develop an inventory system to compete with Walmart. Because if the store's too big, you can't handle the inventory profitably. It's too big, right? It doesn't work. Literally. So it turns out there are sizes that are too big and there's just economies of scale. That's flat out true. All right? So basically, this is what we have. There used to be in Toronto a place called, here's the convenience store. Here's the Loblaws right here. Here's a place that used to be called Nob Hill Farms. There was a place, there was one of them on the lake, Cherry Beach, basically close to there. And there was one at Lansdowne and College. These places were huge. That's the guy who actually one time owned the Maple Leafs, Stavros. And they were really big, and you could get cheap food there. You used to go in there, and they would just bring in skids with potatoes on them. Nothing fancy. A million potatoes piled up in a skid, forklift. You'd go in there, the place was with potatoes all over the floor. Cheap, but ultimately not as cheap as a Loblaws, curiously enough. Because they couldn't, even though it was huge. So people went there for certain things, but in general, it wasn't cheap. So this is the Nob Hill Farms. So I'm drawing this now, grocery stores. Here is a mid-sized grocery store. Okay, like this. Something like this, all right? This is the short-run cost function of a mid-sized grocery store, half the size of the Loblaws. Or it's the average cost function of a small type bookstore that you might still see in town. Or it's the average cost function of a certain type of hardware that you might see in town, kind of small size. The town is full of them, and full of small type bookstores like this and small type grocery stores. This then here is the Loblaws Dominion short run. This is the size, this is the capital, and this is the average cost function of that capital. This is the average cost function of that capital. This is the average cost function of capital, Dominion, Loblaws, etc. This is, in the hardware thing, the average cost function of Lowe's, Home Depot, etc. Etc. This is the Indigo, right? For booksellers. And then over here, we have the average cost function of something like Nob Hill Farms, or there used to be lumber yards, huge lumber yards in Toronto, before we got these kind of low Home Depot places. And bookstores, I can't think of one that would be this size, maybe there was. But anyway, they're different sizes, everybody visualize. The medium-sized grocery store, the Loblaw-sized grocery store, the overly big grocery store, okay? This is 1970, 1980. Okay, so at this stage in the game, in 1980, the price in the marketplace was this. This is P0.